There's a recipe for autocracy that's been tried and tested by leaders throughout history. We've asked 6 of the world's leading scholars how Donald Trump stacks up and what might happen next. In the last episode, we explored how he's managed to hijack the Republican Party. Now, step 2. Every autocrat needs a clan of loyalists, strategists, architects, and masterminds. These are the figures behind the scenes, pulling the strings. They're unelected, unaccountable, and wield a huge amount of power.
Under Title 10 of the U.S. Code, the president has plenary authority.
Stephen? Stephen? Hey, Stephen, can you hear me?
That's Stephen Miller, caught in an awkward moment talking about Donald Trump's plenary authority, another way of saying unlimited power. Miller is Trump's architect-in-chief. His official title doesn't sound all that impressive, Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, but he's so much more than that. In fact, he has so much power in Trump's second administration, he's reportedly referred to as the Prime Minister. So who is Stephen Miller? And how has he pulled the strings to help Trump amass so much power? I'm Justin Bergman, the International Affairs Editor here at The Conversation in Australia, and this is The Making of an Autocrat, Episode 2, Recruit and Architect. Emma Shortis, you're a historian at RMIT University in Melbourne and director of the Australia Institute's International and Security Affairs program. What can you tell us about Donald Trump and Stephen Miller and how they first met?
So Stephen Miller was an aide. Actually, he made his way up to Chief of Communications in the office of Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, who was a very early endorser of Donald Trump and a particular hardliner on immigration. So there was an ideological alignment between the two. And Miller made his way through Sessions' office into the Trump campaign and very quickly became a Trump surrogate, warming up for Trump during stump speeches and came on as a policy advisor. So this is around 2016, very early in that first Trump campaign when he was deeply unpopular in the Republican Party as well. So Stephen Miller came on early and is one of the few people really in Trump's orbit who has hung around for that whole decade. And unlike other figures in Trump's orbit, including figures like Vice President J.D. Vance, Miller's never really had a falling out with Trump or issues with Trump. He has demonstrated really his undying loyalty, and that is clearly appreciated by the president.
Are there any other things that set him apart? All politicians have staff to support them. So what makes Stephen Miller different from the first Trump presidency?
He plays Trump, I think, very well. He understands the president like almost nobody else and demonstrates his undying loyalty, his undying support, and is useful consistently to the president and doesn't forget his place. He knows he is a surrogate and he seeks power within Trump's orbit, within the White House, but doesn't ever undermine the president or, appear to get too big for his boots. So Miller, like a lot of the people that, Trump is drawn to, is a very accomplished communicator. He's very good at making incredibly radical right-wing ideas seem like common sense. He's very good at communicating them and has been practicing that really since he was in high school. So he came into the right-wing media universe very early and really fell into being a warm-up act for Trump. And when he does those warm-up acts, when he speaks for the president, he is particularly good at laundering very hardline ideas. So it's often Miller who will fly the kite for radical uses of the law, for example, that the president then takes up.
But there's no universe in which this nation is going to allow the previous president to flood our nation with millions and millions of illegal aliens who just get to stay here. And we are especially not going to allow a subset of those illegal aliens to rape and murder our citizens. So we are going to...
Tucker Carlson, early on in Miller's relationship with Trump, described him as the intellectual architect of the insurgency against the Republican Party. So Miller plays that crucial ideological architectural role. He is the kind of brains behind particularly Trump's hardline stances on immigration and the Trump administration's ability to use the levers of power and expand the power available to the president. It's Miller who's doing that.
Talk to us about some of his rhetoric. How would you describe it?
Miller's rhetoric, I think, is often quite frightening. It's quite incendiary. He will give sometimes almost screeching speeches about the left-wing conspiracy against the United States, and particularly about who gets to be American. So his speech at Charlie Kirk's funeral, for example, is a standout to me.
You have no idea the dragon you have awakened. You have no idea how determined we will be to save this civilization, to save the West, to save this republic.
That's Miller's vision. He wants to be able to decide who gets to be American. And that's why he talks in such heightened rhetorical terms about the Insurrection Act, for example, and about, particular state governors who are committing insurrection against the United States. And when he does this, what he's doing is flying kites, really, for the MAGA universe about how they might further consolidate power and further oppress their enemies.
And we can assume he has Trump's ear. Trump listens to him. He follows his guidance. Have you ever seen any kind of pushback from Trump on anything related to Stephen Miller and what his thoughts are?
Unusually, there has not, that I can recall, been any pushback from Trump on Miller. And again, that is why he stands out in the Trump universe, because he is so good at this. It makes himself so useful to the president. And, all of the profiles, all of the insider information coming out about Miller says that almost nothing gets to the president without his fingerprints all over it. And you can see that in executive orders and memorandums coming out of the White House that are very much written in the Stephen Miller style. His power appears to go so far in the White House that in one profile of him, he was described as the most powerful unelected bureaucrat in the United States, perhaps in the world. I think, especially in the case of the autocrat that is Trump, we know that Trump is not particularly interested in the details of policy. He is interested in power, he's interested in influence, he's interested in success. And what Miller, the architect, does is hand him that success. And I think what Stephen Miller demonstrates, and history has demonstrated over and over again, is that autocrats cannot rise to power by themselves. They often require a singular kind of charisma and a singular kind of historical moment, but they also need architects behind them who are able to facilitate their rise to power. And Miller is extraordinarily good at that and has, by all accounts, been planning that for a very long time, since he was a teenager.
We'll be right back. Emma Shortis, can you talk a little bit about the attributes of an architect? If you're going to write an official position description for this role, what would the person need to have?
So generally speaking, and this of course isn't universal, it depends on the context and the time and the people around them, but generally speaking, architects like this have been involved in the movement that they are supporting from a very young age. So have often made the decision as a teenager to ingratiate themselves with this movement and in the process become ideological zealots. So they will learn all of the history and all of the ways of speaking, all of the cultural constructs of that particular movement and almost make themselves the center of it or the arbiter of it. In doing that, they will seek out powerful figures in the movement. So they will identify people who play the role of power broker, who can make or break careers, and ingratiate themselves with those people. So they will look for power and follow it very carefully with an eye to building a career within the movement. I think one of the other related characteristics there is loyalty. So demonstrations of loyalty to the movement and eventually to the particular figure who emerges as the successful authoritarian. And that loyalty always goes upwards. So of course, there's always a willingness to undermine lower figures or figures who might be getting in the way of their seeking out of power. But the loyalty to the leader is very consistent until it isn't, until it stops being useful. And I certainly wouldn't be surprised if we saw that characteristic emerge from Miller at a particular time.
Yeah. Can you draw some comparisons in history to other people who have served in this role? How does Miller compare to people in the past?
So Karl Rove played a very similar role to Miller in the universe of the Bushes. So he was the architect of Bush Jr.'s election victories and played a very important coordinating role in Bush's office, in Bush's White House, with a very similar kind of nondescript title like Stephen Miller's. Stephen Miller is, what is he? Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, which, sounds fairly innocuous, but has that very powerful, unelected bureaucratic position, much like Karl Rove, where power kind of circles around this figure. The other comparison in American history that I think is an interesting one is actually adjacent to Karl Rove. It's the Dick Cheney comparison. Dick Cheney was widely regarded to be the most powerful vice president really in recent American history, certainly in post-war American history, in terms of both his influence in the White House, in his influence, for example, on the beginning of the Iraq War, but also in his lasting legacy on the institutions of American power. Cheney played a critical role in facilitating the consolidation of power in the executive branch. He was a deep believer in the unitary executive theory, which, aims to consolidate power in the executive branch. And much of what Cheney did in doing that is facilitating now what Trump is doing. It may be too early to say this, but certainly Miller, I think, is having perhaps an even bigger influence on the long-term trajectory of American politics than those two figures.
Can we talk about one comparison that the historian Timothy Snyder made? He recently posted a video to his Substack.
And my subject today is Stephen Miller and Stalinism. Now, this may not seem like the obvious way to approach the topic of Mr. Miller, but I would suggest that there are some uncanny resemblances between the careers of the two men.
Do you see a comparison here?
I think it's a really interesting comparison, and I think Schneider is very careful to not make ideological comparisons, but just to the form of power that Miller is wielding and comparing it to Stalin. And I think the comparison is really an apt one. There was a weekend not so long ago where social media was speculating that Trump had died because he hadn't been seen in public for a long time. And of course, many of us were thinking about what that would mean, what the death of a president would mean in this particular context. And the comparison I immediately went to was the death of Lenin. Stalin understood the nature of the Communist Party that he was dealing with. He understood how to wield power within that party and was able to leverage his networks, that he had built over several decades to consolidate that power. And also had the vision to see how things would play out as Lenin deteriorated and as he eventually died. That there is this tendency to think that if Trump disappears, everything, the whole MAGA universe disappears with him. But that comparison to Miller, who occupies a similar position of power to Stalin, a century ago in the Soviet Union, I think arguably the evidence suggests that he would be able to maneuver in that way to consolidate his own power and has always planned to do that. So I think that is a really important comparison and shows that there are characteristics that define these kinds of architects and unelected bureaucrats and how they facilitate the rise of authoritarians. But one of the things I really admire about Schneider's history is the way that he doesn't insist that any of this is inevitable. Figures like this can rise and fall very quickly and are subject to the contingencies of history.
Do you think Trump would have the power he has today without Stephen Miller?
That's a good question. No, I don't think Trump would have the power he does today without Stephen Miller. I think Trump has risen to power off the back of his own instincts, his rhetorical power, off the back of an incredibly unique moment in American history. But Stephen Miller has facilitated that rise to power, and he has, in particular, in Trump's second term, facilitated the rise of authoritarianism and the consolidation of power in the White House in the way that I think no one else had previously been able to do in Trump's orbit. I think Stephen Miller learned the lessons of the first Trump presidency more than anybody else and has been very busy implementing them. And I think if we see Trump go further down the road of authoritarianism, which all the evidence suggests that he will, that again will be largely facilitated by Stephen Miller.
Emma Shortis, thanks so much for your time.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, Justin.
You can read more from Emma Shortis at The Conversation. This episode was produced by Isabella Podwinski, sound designed by Michelle Macklem. Our head of audio is Gemma Ware, and our head of editorial innovation is Ashlyn McGee. Misha Ketchell is the editor of The Conversation Australia, and Stephen Kahn is the editor-in-chief of The Conversation UK. The Conversation is a not-for-profit media organization. You can sign up to our free daily newsletter by clicking the link in our show notes. You can also listen to more of our shows wherever you get your podcasts.